Welcome back. You're still tuned into Trading Hour, and it's time to talk all about AI, technology, semiconductors, and a lot more. In fact, in recent news, India and the US have tied up for setting up a chip manufacturing plant in India. And the other talking point is, of course, the ever-expanding artificial intelligence landscape. Let's get in Gokul Hariharan, co-head of APAC TMT Research at j.p.morgan, coming in and joining in from the sidelines of the j.p.morgan India Investor Summit. Mr. Hariharan, good morning. Thank you so much for joining in today. You did have an interesting Asian tech tour. You met 40 companies on the tour, and the takeaways have been quite interesting as well. Something that stood out for you, how we are seeing demand when it comes to semiconductor, the chip supply issues, if they are getting over very soon, and how are investors perceiving that big boom that we are seeing in artificial intelligence?
Yeah, good morning, and thanks for having me on. So I think the technology industry is going through a pretty interesting cycle. We're essentially getting a K-shaped recovery here. Everything AI related is booming. We've had this boom since 2023, and it's continuing to go. There's obviously some questions about whether we are kind of at the peak of this. We don't think so. There is still pretty strong growth coming through from heavy investments in foundational large language models developed by a lot of the cloud services providers. There is also incremental demand coming through from sovereign AI. Countries such as India and other countries also developing their own AI. So AI clearly remains an important driver for growth for semiconductors in the next 2 to 3 years. We think that this is likely to last for another 2 to 3 years. At the same time, a lot of the areas where we saw a lot of incremental demand during the pandemic period in 2020 and 2021, including a lot of the older generation chips and associated products, they have been in a bit of a post-pandemic funk. So we're still going through a little bit of a correction in those segments. They're still kind of bouncing along the bottom, which is why I said there was a K-shaped recovery. We're kind of seeing a little bit of a light at the end of the tunnel for that segment. So that should probably start to come back up in 2025. That would contribute to the stronger growth for semiconductors in 25 and 26. Lastly, I think as Gen AI becomes more broad-based and we see a wider adoption, we will start to see a lot of Gen AI applications start to come on to the edge devices, or the devices that you and I use, smartphones, PCs, etc. Apple already talked about Apple Intelligence coming through with the iPhone 16 products, and we'll see a lot of other manufacturers also bring these functions to devices, which will be potentially the next leg of driver or next growth driver for semiconductors as it pertains to AI.
Mr. Hariharan, good morning. Thank you so much for joining in. I'd like to go on to that semiconductor push that India is currently having and the announcements that were made on the Prime Minister's tour to the United States. Do you see that? Of course, it is a long gestation period, right, for a semiconductor unit to come around and then production begins and all of that. But do you see this move as the first step for India to become that semiconductor manufacturing hub that it aspires to be?
Yeah, I think very interesting times here. I think I've covered semis for 20 years. The first time that we're starting to see something really happen back home in India, so that's very exciting. I think India is going about it in the right way, I would say. There are probably 2 or 3 things which are fundamental. First, I think the government policy seems to be pretty consistent and also very realistic at the same time, not really trying to do very advanced semiconductors, which only very few companies in the world do. Trying to start at more manageable kind of aspirations. Second, I think the companies that are starting to invest in India, we are starting to see big companies, Micron and a few other global companies invest. Also, some of the bigger conglomerates in India, Tata Group and others, are also starting to invest. So there is support from local biggies as well as MNCs for this push. And third is the external factor, right? I think the whole world is looking at some degree of supply chain diversification. People want a China plus one or a greater China plus one kind of supply strategy, and that's kind of come into sharp focus. A lot of countries are trying to find that next destination. I think India clearly has a role to play as a potential destination there. Now, I think if you look at the semiconductor ecosystem itself, there are various parts to that ecosystem. India is kind of starting to take some baby steps, largely in the assembly and packaging, or packaging of chips, you could say. That's probably the right place to start because A, it is labor intensive, which kind of caters to the lower cost skilled labor available in India. Secondly, the entry barrier in terms of technology and IP is not that steep, so new companies can actually come on to this pretty quickly. It's still a smaller part of the value chain, but that's probably a good start. Now, if you look forward a little bit, I think the two areas which are the higher value adding parts of the supply chain, one is design, chip design itself. That's where American companies like Qualcomm and NVIDIA basically lead the market. India has actually the largest or one of the largest pool of design talent, chip design talent domestically, roughly about 300,000 people working on chip design. Only thing is that it has not really coalesced into something that could be a homegrown company. There are a few interesting startups coming up in the chip design space, in analog chips, mixed signal, IoT, etc. But that's still a very early step. But if that can start to crystallize, that's going to be quite powerful. The second part, obviously, is the holy grail, which is the wafer fabrication or the fab, as people call it. That's quite difficult. India is already announced maybe one or two fabs. I think Tata Group has announced one. There are a couple of others also that have been announced. That's going to be a little bit more of a longer journey, as you suggested. It's probably going to take 5 to 7 years. And you have to start at a more mature kind of technologies, not go directly to extremely leading edge technologies. I think India is doing the right things. I think if you look at some of the new fabs that have been announced, they're mostly focusing on mature technologies. They're also bringing in partners who already have experience working on these technologies for many years. So that's, I think, the right approach. But this is something where consistent policy would be required, which I think the government seems to be pretty committed to do. And it will take time. It's not going to have a quick result. It's probably going to take 5 to 7 years. That is required for the ecosystem to kind of clearly get established, have some kind of a critical mass, and then that kind of starts to feed on itself. Now, just as an aside, I think TSMC is a company that I follow. They are kind of like the market leader in terms of technology prowess today. But if you look back 35 years back or 37 years back when they started, they also started with N-3 or 3 generations or 4 generations older process technology compared to what was the state of the art at that point in time. So you have to start usually a little bit behind. But over a period of time, once that momentum comes through, I think you can kind of start advancing. So it's a great start, and I think there is clearly a lot of momentum. We saw this in a couple of the presentations that we had in the India Investor Summit as well, that the momentum is clearly there, both from the policymakers as well as from the big companies.
Okay, all right, Mr. Hariharan, such a pleasure speaking with you. We had a lot more questions, but we have run out of time. But that's an interesting take. Of course, exciting times ahead for the semiconductor industry in India and globally as well. That's the word coming in from J.P. Morgan on everything AI, tech and semiconductors. But we have to move on and talk